Okay, it's time to start promoting my 5,000th gig. Yep, Shepherd's Bush Empire, April the 2nd, 2022. Now, I was thinking, how would rock and roll's greatest failure promote his 5,000th show? And I was thinking, what are the biggest turn-offs in entertainment? And I asked a few people, and someone suggested, you know what it's like when someone invites you around to see their holiday snaps? And I thought, oh, that's a good idea. I could invite people round to see my gig 5,000 snaps. And then somebody said, oh, I know something worse than that. Have you ever been invited round to see somebody's holiday slides? And he introduced me to this instrument of torture, the Kodak Carousel Slide Projector. Now, the insidious thing about this particular projector is the design of the carousel mechanism, which means that when you've watched all the slides, the narcissist projectionist can just press a button and go, tell you what, should we watch all those again? So here we go, the gig 5,000 slideshow. Okay, I know what you're all thinking. You're thinking, oh, we're going to start at gig 1 and there's only 4,999 gigs to go. But that's baby Otway. You've got nearly 20 years to go before we get to gig 1. But don't worry, baby Otway is growing up fast and is already stage struck. And by the time I was 6 years old, I joined the Dinky Toys Club. Now, the boy on the left is me, and I think the one on the right's Willie Barrett. In order that our house didn't become a historical monument and place of pilgrimage as Otway's birthplace, the Aylesbury Borough Council sensibly flattened the house and tarmacked it over and covered it with a dual carriageway, which means we had to move from Whitehall Street to Wendover Road, where, as a young boy, I would try to learn to drive and worked on the things that I would need in my chosen career. I learnt to throw shapes on my own and with my sister and practice my autograph. As my mother wouldn't let me have a guitar, I learnt to play a violin. But eventually I got too big for my mum to stop me having a guitar. It didn't take me too long to find out which way round it went, and I was on my way. The Aylesbury Borough Council decided they didn't want Wendover Road to become an Otway museum and devised a road widening scheme which involved a complete demolition of the property. And so we moved to Ash Grove, which was conveniently close to the Grange School, Aylesbury, where I went to school and did my first ever gig. Now, there is actually a recording of my first ever gig, but the quality isn't very good. Now, there are 3 things that really affect the quality of the recording. One is how you tighten the strings on the guitar. Another is where you put your fingers on those strings. And the other is how you push the air through the vocal cords. And at that point in my career, I hadn't really perfected any of these things. After leaving school, I completed my education at a pub called the Derby Arms in Aylesbury. It was also where Wild Willie Barrett ran a folk club called the Bog Hog. It was a tough old gig. Acts died there so often they even built their own graveyard. And my first few gigs were a mixture of Willie's Bog Hog Club, the Grange School, and the local College of Further Education. But for gig 9 on April the 2nd, 1971, I was booked to play Friars. Friars was a brilliant club. I played it 17 times from gig 9 in 1971 to gig 4,768 in 2018. And here's some of the flyers from those gigs. I was awarded a cup for being the first local act to sell the place out. And amongst the shots of me playing there live is one of my favourites. This was taken before Photoshop and without any special lenses. This is what I actually looked like on stage. I teamed up with Chris Needs, a bongo player, and by gig 14 I passed this major milestone that every artist must pass on that road to stardom. My very first gig contract. The artists agreed to appear for the fee of £7 for one 15-minute performance at the Market Square, Aylesbury on Saturday the 3rd of July 1971. As I discovered, a pop star cannot live on £7 a gig, and so, as reported by the local paper, I supplemented my income by being a dustman. By gig 50, I'd been in the studio with Wild Willie Barrett and we'd recorded our first record, Misty Mountain. Pete Townsend heard the record, liked it, and offered to produce us. Now, these photographs were taken by Pete Townsend in his garden. I like this one best, partly because I think I look good in it, and Willie isn't in it at all. After getting together and splitting up several times, by gig 100, John Otway and Wild Willie Barrett were in fact a duo. I made the front page of the local music paper, and me and Wild Willie Barrett recorded our first album. This led to an appearance on The Old Grey Whistle Test, where I did this, and this, which led to a hit record. Even though I couldn't drive, I was able to afford my own Bentley and a jukebox to play my hit on. And to make sure that the jukebox didn't get filled up too quickly with Otway and Barrett hits, we split up before we put out another record. But I had a couple of very big gigs coming up, so I had to get a band together. And they needed to be gig fit. So I booked a week's residency in the Red Cow in Hammersmith. The problem was that halfway through the week's residency, the pub had a drag night. And because it attracted a big audience, the pub did not want to give up their drag night. So, no problems. I got Kathy, my girlfriend, to do my makeup and did the gig in a dress. And after that, my new band were prepared for anything. Because what they had to prepare for was gig 387 in the Aylesbury Market Square, my hometown. We closed off the town. I love these photos, I've got loads and loads of them. And just look at the size of the audience. This was one of my favourite gigs of the whole 5,000. Gig 387, and following it a couple of days later was Reading Festival. Gig 388. A real high spot in my career. And the reason I say high spot is because what happened after that was a bit lower. Because after our success in the UK, I got a new band together and we went to Crack America. But as you can see from the slides, the crowds we got for our Central Park, New York gig were a little smaller than the crowds that had turned out to see me in Aylesbury Market Square. And in the way that this slide sums up gig 387, this next slide pretty much sums up gig 500. Desperate for another hit, me and Willie teamed up again and went on the DK5080 tour. We enjoyed the gigs. They were great. But the accommodation was really intense, and nothing improved for the next 500 gigs. Eventually, Willie went off on one, and by gig 1000, I decided that I would follow the 3 R's, guitarist-wise. Robin, Ronnie, and Richard. And if you wanted to know what 1,500 gigs does to a guitarist, it takes you from this to this. The other 3 R's that followed those first 1,000 gigs were the 3 roadies: Brian, John, and Deadly. Now, in rock and roll, the roadies do a lot of essential jobs. They catch the guitars, they hold the ladder, and they make sure you eat properly. Because if they don't, it can go down the wrong way. And as you can see, this diet of microphones wasn't very healthy for me or my career. And it wasn't till around gig 1500 when I took the counterintuitive step of selling myself as rock and roll's greatest failure that things started to improve. Because by selling myself in that way, I found it a lot easier to live up to people's expectations. And by gig 1888, both me and Richard Hogarth, my guitarist, thought it was about time I had a band, and added Murray Torkelson on rhythm guitar, Seymour on bass, and Adam Batterby on drums. Now, we had noticed that gig 1888 wasn't that far away from 2,000 gigs. But we had some more intense gigs to do before we got to 2000, noticeably Glastonbury, which some band members enjoyed a little more than others. There was talk of having some sort of band uniform, and Adam suggested we all wore hats. So some of us gave it a go. Some of us weren't quite as enthusiastic, but in the end the whole idea had to be dropped because Deadly the roadie, he just got too carried away. Okay, coming on to gig 2000. I'm going to make a list of my 5 favourite gigs out of the 5,000. And my first one is Aylesbury Market Square, and number 2 is definitely gig 2000. After all the difficult years of my career not going so well, Richard Cotton put together a plan for my 2000th gig, and we got 2,000 people in the Astoria. A huge turnaround. And from this slide here, you can see how I've embraced the idea of rock and roll's greatest failure. Whereas the Bentley summed up Otway the Star perfectly, nothing could capture the new Otway as well as the Sinclair C5. Following gig 2000 was obviously the next gig, 2001 A Space Otway. And we decided we'd go international and took a coachload of fans over to Dunkirk. The Dunkirk trips were popular, and we did them for the next 14 years. Because what the fans liked about them was not the shows, I mean they were all right, but watching me jump into the Channel at the end of November wasn't spectacular, but it was a spectacle. The question I've been asking myself was, after gig 2000, how many gigs would it take to do the Albert Hall? And the answer to that is 678. So here's my third choice of my 5 favourite gigs of the 5,000. Around gig 3000, me and Richard joined Dr. Feelgood, the Hamsters and Eddie and the Hot Rods on the Naughty Rhythms tour. 74 gigs, the longest we'd ever done. And Eddie and the Hot Rods were so impressed with what Richard was like on stage, they kidnapped him. And he's been a hot rod hostage ever since. Oh dear, what's that doing there? Can we skip over the next couple of slides? It wasn't just me that noticed that I hadn't had a hit for a while. A lot of other people had noticed it too. So we put a campaign together to get a hit for my 50th birthday. And so, gig 3131 was at Abbey Road Studios, where me and 1,000 fans recorded the B-side. Gig 3171 was at the Astoria, where we announced, after a fan vote, what the hit was going to be. And 3204 is my fourth choice of favourite gigs. It's the London Palladium, where we got into the top 10, announced on stage by Johnny Walker. So if that was gig at 3204, you know what 3205 is going to be, don't you? It's Top of the Pops! Now, after the success of the hit campaign, I decided I'd do an even more ambitious project, the John Otway World Tour. Now, most people, especially those that bought tickets, don't regard this particular project as a success, because when the major form of transport turned out to be too expensive, the whole world tour was just one date at the Cavern in Liverpool. Funnily enough, what most people that came on that world tour in Liverpool remember most was being entertained by Glenn Tilbrook, who sang Leaving on a Jet Plane as a poignant reminder to the audience on how far they weren't going. And so, by gig 4000, desperate measures were required. So, in desperation, I teamed up with Wild Willie Barrett again for the incompatible Otway and Barrett tour. The great thing about the disaster of the world tour was that it gave me an excuse to make the film of my life. Otway the movie, rock and roll's greatest failure. And I love this slide. This is me arriving at the premiere at the Odeon, Leicester Square, in style. Let's have a look at a few more of these slides. And because we had a movie, me and 100 fans in my own image were able to go to Cannes in France to show the movie and do a gig. After a crowdfunding campaign, me and the band went to Montserrat in the Caribbean to record the Montserrat album. And 50 fans turned up to check us out, so we did a gig for them in this wonderful little beach bar. And it's funny, you know, I've lost count of the number of times members of the band have come up to me and said, "Otway, when are we going to do another one like that 4597th? Which brings us to 2020 and the lockdown. So the last few gigs have been done from my living room, which even had its own tour t-shirt. So it's nearly the end of the slideshow. Just a few more gig pics that I really like. And then we can watch it all again. No, not really. Just the first little bit. Okay, it's time to start promoting my 5,000th gig. Yep, Shepherd's Bush Empire, April the 2nd, 2022.